crafty friends, it's Jess from jesscrafts.com, and today I'm here with another 6x6 paper pad tutorial. Today's tutorial will feature the Echo Park Summer Dreams collection. I will use the 6x6 paper pad as well as the ephemera, and I decided to supplement it with a stamp set. It's the Lawn Fawn Wild for You stamp set. This is part of a guest design position with Scrapbooking with Me, which is a online store and Facebook group that sells. And I'm going to leave you a link to all of their different social media stores, etc. in the video description, but also a coupon code. So if you're interested in these products or you want to check out some of the fall and winter collections that are coming out, they're starting to have pre-orders for that as well. So I do definitely think they're worth checking out. And if you see any of the products in stock, of course, you can use the coupon code, which is awesome. So here we have the ephemera pack, and I separated ones that I thought would be useful versus ones that were a little bit more scrapbooking oriented. Like one of them says vacation. I don't really think that's going to work on a card, so I just separated it out, but luckily that was only a few pieces. Then I'm going to flip through the papers just to kind of like put my head in, the right space of kind of thinking of ideas. How do I want to use them? I'm noticing that there are some solid papers. So there's this one that's blue on one side and pink on the other, and I thought that might be a good way to take advantage of the stamp set because I could stamp some of the animals on the blue. Particularly I thought the mouse and the elephant would work on blue. It's not necessarily the most traditional color for elephants and mice. They're usually gray, but I think that blue works pretty well for them too. And then it would keep it in the scheme of the color pack, and I wouldn't have to color them. I would just cut them out from the blue paper. And so I did cut out a few of the elephants and the mice from this blue pattern paper using my scan and cut. And then I stamped the alligator and some mice and one of the lion that's in the set, on some of the really simple wood grain paper that was in the Summer Dreams collection. And that one, though, I could not cut with my scan and cut because it kept seeing the wood grain lines as lines. And so I wound up fussy cutting those, which would be one reason that, working with pattern paper, it might be a little bit harder to cut things out, whereas with dies, you could cut it out. So I don't necessarily think it's worth purchasing the dies for those rare occasions, but it's just something that I wanted to point out and being honest with any of my products. So now what I'm doing is I'm finding some of the ephemera that I think I could stamp sentiments on, and I'm going to stamp a bunch of sentiments from the set because that was the other reason I wanted to pull in a stamp set. There really weren't a lot of sentiments on these ephemera, and the Doodlebug does include a lot of sentiments because they have one of the cut apart sheets just has a whole bunch of sentiments. So I do supplement those sometimes as well, but I really needed to in this particular instance, and this stamp set had the For You and the You Rule sentiment, which are great general sentiments for donation cards. So I just kind of worked through a little pile of ones that I thought could use a sentiment, and I just stamped them all at one time rather than stopping and stamping on every card. Now I'm ready to start cutting my paper and thinking about how I want to actually assemble some cards. What's interesting about the Echo Park is it's not a true 6x6, it's actually a little bit bigger, but there's the hole in the top, and I'm going to talk about that and kind of use that, not necessarily to my advantage, but I am not going to cut them down to true 6x6 and just toss that piece. I think that actually a lot of times you can cover up that hole, work around it, and it allows you to actually have a little bit more paper and work with some different sizes than you might have with a traditional 6x6 pad. With that ice cream paper, though, because I decided that I wanted to take one set of papers because there's two of each. There's 24 double-sided papers and there's 12 designs. I decided that I wanted to pick one paper that I would cut into 3x3 squares. It's a pretty common thing that I do with 6x6 pads just because I like to have some options for layering. I think that I take every other paper in the collection besides that ice cream paper and I cut it down to a typical A2 size, just under an A2 size because I like to have a white border on my cards, so I cut it to 4 by 5 1/4. As always, I will have a coordinating blog post for this set of cards that will talk about some of the different measurements that I use. There are a lot of cards. There's 25 cards, and because I'm using the ephemera, I had to make more unique cards. A lot of times with the pattern paper collections, if I'm just using the pattern paper, I can make the same card twice. but there's only one piece of each ephemera. So I don't mind having to do it that way. It does just make blogging about the cards a little bit trickier, and you have to be a little bit more creative because you can't always do 2 of the same exact thing. But a lot of times I try to do 2 of something similar so that it took a little bit less, design effort, because it's hard to come up with 25 unique ideas, but also to keep it a little bit more simple for you guys to follow along. So I'm going to be left with these 2 by, I would say it's probably, because it's a little longer than 6. I think that it's probably 6.5. But when you tear it out of the book, it does create a little bit of fraying at the top. So a lot of times I had to trim it, but you'll get these 2 by about 6.5 inch strips. And then these 4 by, I don't know, a little over, maybe 1.25 inches or so strips. But I wanted to try to create some simple cards to kind of get my juices flowing. So I picked these 2 ice cream, it's an ice cream and a snow cone image, and they were very similar. So I could kind of create 2 of the same card because they were the same size ephemera piece. And so I did something really simple. I took one of those 2 by 6 inch strips and I cut it in half, or it's a little more than 6, but you know what I mean. I'm going to probably accidentally call them 6 inch a million times, but I took one of those 2 inch strips and I cut it in half, and I mounted the little ephemera on it, and then I stamped the For You there because the For You didn't fit on the piece of ephemera. And that created one really simple card to kind of get me started. I thought, well, let me see if I can find a few more cut aparts that are pretty similar in size. There was these 2 tiny tags. I thought, well, great, I'll make another set of cards, simple, again, just to kind of get the ideas flowing, to get a few cards out there. And so here I was able to take one of those smaller 4 by whatever size pieces, those little 4 by scraps, and I could cover the hole. So because those 4 inch scraps have a hole in it, in order to keep it wide like this, you have to either cover up the hole or you have to make it thinner and cut the whole area off. But a lot of times I was just able to cover it up, which I liked because it made it a little bit more of a substantial strip, for instance. And this is the point early on where I also decided that I usually like to try to pick something in my craft room that I can use up to go with these. And a lot of times I work with ribbon, but today I decided to work particularly with twine, because I feel like I, bought every color of twine under the sun a few years ago, and I still have it all. So I decided that I would work with that. So I put the twine through the tag hole at the top, and then I used some foam tape to pop up the tag on those 2 cards. And again, I had 2 quick and simple cards. As mentioned before, the measurements are going to be in a blog post. So if you need to kind of slow down, take a longer look at the cards, no worries on that, because I do have to go fast to fit it all into a reasonable size video. And reasonable is 40 minutes today because of the unique designs. So I saw this Ferris wheel cut apart, and I thought, well, it'd be fun to pair it with the Ferris wheel paper. So I sort of just started playing with those and pulling little scraps from the side. And the 3x3 I intentionally cut, so it's not quite a scrap, but I take a card base and a piece of ephemera and just start pulling from the pile of smaller pieces and layering it together and trying to think about how the colors mix with each other, not putting too much pattern. The Ferris wheel pattern paper in the background has a pretty small pattern. The pink paper there is also a pretty small pattern. So I didn't want to also use the ice creams, which are on the other side of the stripe paper. So I'm a big fan of kind of flipping over the papers, and that's why I personally prefer double-sided paper, because I get 2 choices. So here's another thing that I'm going to do with twine, and I'm going to do it a few times, so I won't always go through the full process, but if I describe it once, hopefully it's helpful. So I want to tie a twine bow, and what I'm going to do is cut a piece of twine that is about 3 times the length of the card. And so the card's about 5 1/4, 3 times that, about 15 inches of twine. Then I'm going to wrap it all the way around the card and tie a bow. I find this much easier than trying to cut small pieces. It does use a little bit more twine, but most twine is super cheap and we have a ton of it. So I don't mind going all the way around. But it, again, it uses more twine. I do tape the back once I'm done tying the bow. But I don't put any adhesive till I'm done tying the bow, so that as I'm fussing with the bow, I can tie it wherever I want on the card and then move it into position. So wrap it around, tie it, fuss with it, then tape it down on the back. And you don't need any adhesive on the front, so you don't have to worry about trying to hide any adhesive behind the bow or anything like that. You just tape it on the back. And hopefully that's a helpful tip for those of you who are trying to use some twine and find tying bows to be a little bit tricky or not quite sure how to approach it in an easy way. That's what I've personally found most effective. And most twine is pretty thin, so you don't have to use foam tape to compensate, so you can still tape it down flat to a card even though there's twine behind the piece of paper. But sometimes I do like to pop it up, especially if I'm going to use a bunch of twine, and I'm going to talk about that later in the video as I do use more twine. But there I was going to tie a bow on that card as well, so I'm not going to show you tying a bow every time. That'll get super boring. I am trying to, again, go with some cards that are pretty similar to each other. So here I picked this ice cream background paper, or sorry, ice pop background paper, and I thought, well, I want to find two images that really like would make a whole sort of ice cream or sweet treat card, because there's ice cream and there's snow cones and they're all that together. But anyway, so I thought, well, I want to find some stuff that is really thematic, and so I picked out the 3x3 square of ice cream paper, and I picked out the sandals because sandals, summertime ice cream kind of thing, but also the ice pop ephemera, and sort of like kind of playing from there, like what could I label that layer that ice pop on to make it a little bit more substantial. That frame really worked out, and so then I had a really quick and simple card there. Then with the flip-flops, I kind of felt like they were getting lost in that ice cream paper, so I wanted to give them something else. And I went with this pink piece of paper. But then I thought, well, part of my goal today here is to use some twine, and I did use twine on the ice pop card, so how can I use twine on this card? I found this large piece of like pink and red wrapped twine, so it's a little bit different than the traditional that's wrapped with white. And I decided, since there was so much of it and I'd had it for years and not used it, I was going to use a bunch on this card. And I just actually I put a little bit of adhesive on the center of this piece of paper. And it's actually a solid piece of paper because there is a little bit of solid in this particular paper pad collection. And I'm just going to wrap this twine until I've wrapped it, like 6 times or so, giving it like a pretty substantial weight to the panel, and kind of made it like a clear design element, rather than just using a single piece of twine, which I think would have got lost in this card and wouldn't have really provided a because it's creating a line that the flip-flops will go over, so it's drawing your attention to the flip-flops. I think that just one piece of twine would have looked kind of odd. A couple of pieces helped. You didn't have to do as many if you want to save a bit more, not use up as many resources, but like I said, the point for me was actually to kind of use up something. So I used the twine to create a pretty substantial decorative piece there, and then I'm going to use foam tape because otherwise with so much of that twine it would be really lumpy underneath that cut apart, so the foam kind of helps it to pop up. And again, I'm going to use foam to attach that pink piece to the card just because I used so much twine. And throughout the video, I'm going to use all kinds of different foam tapes. I kind of just grab what's near me, and this video I recorded over a few days, so what was on my desk changed, or I was trying to use up some old bits of foam tape. I'm not able to link to every foam tape that I use in the video description, and I've gotten questions about it, but I don't really think it makes much of a difference. They're all pretty much the same to me personally. The scotch is really dependable and easy to get, so it's usually what I link to because it's, like if I see a great deal on foam somewhere else, I might get it, but if I can't find it, I'm just going to default to scotch. So here's another frame that I'm working on. I decided this time to pick up 2 of the frames from the ephemera set, and I thought that's another way I could make cards that were a little bit more similar if they both had frames. So I'm going to take some of the pieces of more lightly patterned paper, like smaller patterns, and I'm going to trim them until they fill the back of the frames, and then I'll use a little bit of adhesive on the back of the frames and place those in. And that was kind of like my first step to get started, because then I could start seeing like what do I want to put on these frames. And this is where I think for the first time I start pulling in the little critters from the stamp set, because I've used a few of the ephemera pieces that had their own interesting thing, like the one with the Ferris wheel or the ice creams or ice pops and sandals and all that. But like I'm running low on those, and I'm down to things like the frames, which, you know, they kind of need a little help in my opinion. Or so I'm going to start pulling in the critters. I decided that the lion, the lion would look good on that other one because I didn't like the way that the blue elephant looked on a blue background. So I wanted to have a little more contrast. So I'm going to color up that elephant. So I color up that lion, fussy cut him out, and use him on this card. But I'm going to concentrate on building another card that I have everything ready for right now. I'm going to go back to the stamp set, and I'm going to make this one actually a birthday card. Now, this birthday card won't be able to be donated because the place that I donate doesn't accept birthday cards. However, it'll just be one card that I save for, you know, personal use, because of course I do send out cards as well. But of the 25 cards that I made today, a majority of them will be going to donations. So I like the idea of the elephant, but I felt like he was a little big. And I also kind of wanted to put one in each corner because there was that like extra space on each side of the wild. So I went with the smaller elephant and the mouse. And then I was like, well, you know, they have the wild thing, but there's really nothing that ties them to the idea of birthday. So I kind of searched my scraps and decided that I'd stamp 2 little birthday hats for them. And I'm going to fussy cut those out just because it would be faster than putting it through my scan and cut. And they're simple shapes. So I'll fussy cut those out when I'm fussy cutting out the lion and be able to finish off that card. Since that frame has 2 holes, like one on each side, I decided to fit some twine through it, but this time I knew I was going to use like a little bit more twine, not just one piece, because again I wanted to have a little more weight. So I'm just threading through 3 pieces, and then I'm using Scotch tape to tape it to the back. You could, of course, just wrap it all the way around the card, but in that particular instance, I actually found it easier, since it had to be threaded through the tag, to just cut the pieces. And then, of course, you know, it saves a little bit of materials, but that really wasn't much of a goal of mine. So again, here I'm going to do the same thing where I take that 4-inch strip with a hole in it, and I cover the hole with my element so that I can keep the wide strip, yet you know, not have that sort of unsightly little hole there kind of thing. I think that strategy worked pretty well throughout the whole thing. It does kind of limit your options because like I had to put them on the left side of the card instead of the right, but that wasn't a big deal to me. And I thought, again, I'm really trying to use twine, so I'm going to again put a little bow, and that will kind of add to the weight of the right side. And so here I'm going to again just wrap. Sorry, I thought I was going to put a bow. I'm not. I'm just doing a wrap again. So I'm going to wrap it around. Yeah, I think I looked at the idea of a bow, and because that Ferris wheel paper is a little busy, I think the bow would have got lost on it. So instead, I wrapped it around 3 times with that heavier weight of twine. So I just kind of try to explain like why am I doing bows sometimes and not, and because there is a little bit of a reason to it. You know, a certain amount of it's just like, oh, I felt like it at the time, but there's also like design things to consider. Like a twine bow is really insubstantial. It's, you know, it's small, it's thin, it gets lost on busy pattern paper. So it's just something that you want to keep in mind. My paper and ephemera is, I think we're about like halfway through using everything. And so I'm getting more limited in what I have left. But I saw that I kind of thought, well, you know, this Hello Sunshine is a bit smaller than the sunglasses there, but they're similar in size in terms of being like long and thin. So I thought, you know, I'll use them together. I saw this piece of yellow paper, and I thought, well, the yellow won't look good with the Hello Sunshine because they're both yellow, but the yellow will look really good with the blue sunglasses. Yellow and blue tend to, you know, pop off each other pretty well. So I thought, well, I'll just turn it over and use the other side for the other, the other piece of ephemera. And so that's a fun way of using it too. Like you can create a pretty similar card, but if you turn over one of the papers and use the opposite pattern, there'll be a little bit different, but you don't really have to like design a whole new card or a whole new, you know, layout choice. And I decided to pair the Hello Sunshine and the sunglasses with that flamingo background paper. It was one of the ones that I felt like I really need to start using that flamingo paper because it's very summery, and I don't know if I'm going to want, like, what I'm going to want to pair it with. So while I still had some choices left, I decided to use that paper. I'm again going to put a little bit of twine through the tag. I tend to fold it in half, put the folded end through, and then take the loose ends and tuck them under the folded end. And that's kind of how I do tags, but you can do them, you know, however you like. So here I'm going to do the bow option again. I'm going to choose the bow option because the pattern paper that I'm tying the bow on is a lot less busy. It's, you know, not quite a solid, but it is 3 solid colors in an ombre, or not ombre, but you know what I mean? Like, you're going to see the bow because it's mostly going to be a bow on blue as opposed to a bow on a big old pattern kind of thing. So again, I said I want to use those flamingos up before I don't have any choices, so I'm also going to use those flamingo strips here, and I'm going to pair them with this blue paper or minty sort of paper, and it doesn't look patterned, but it actually is. It has this really small scale pattern, and I decided I'd pick some other little elements that still went with the flamingos. I noticed that these 2 little, I guess labels would be a good term for it. The labels are, again, similar in size. One's a little bigger than the other, but again, I can try to create more similar cards. I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Sorry, it's sometimes really hard to talk for 40 minutes, guys, about cards, so I apologize. But I decided to create a banner this time to mix it up. I hadn't done a lot of banners, and I'm going to, again, go for the twine wrap technique. As I went a little further in the card video, I was also kind of determined to use up that pink bit of twine because that would be like the first time I ever used up twine like in my crafting life. So I decided, like, you know what, I'm gonna go for it. I'm actually gonna use up a supply instead of like holding on to it for years and years and years. So that's kind of the reason I went with the wrap technique this time, even though you probably could have done a bow, because again, that the flamingo paper was a little bit less busy than some others. So here again, I'm like using up scraps of Scotch foam tape and then moving on to my big roll because I'm going to use up whatever I have, what's on my table. I'm not super fussy about like, oh, I only use this or that. I need this special foam tape. So as long as it's the same size, it works for me. And here, because I popped up that banner, I also had to pop up the half of that label there because it was gonna, hang off of the banner. And I'm gonna create a pretty similar card with the other one. You see, I chose to use the elephant with it. Here I am using the big tag that had said, I hope you have a bright sunshiny day. And I thought that paired really well with the sunglasses. And at first I thought it was kind of silly to use 2 pieces of ephemera together because there's only so much of it. But the sunglasses are so small. It's hard to make them their own centerpiece on a card, so I paired them together. And that was going to be a pretty simple card. So then I moved on to another relatively large piece of ephemera, which was this like frame/banner thing. And I had an elephant left, so I stuck him inside it, and I thought that worked out fine. And then I'm going to sort of figure out, now that I know I want to use that big tag and that other big frame that are, again, pretty similar in size, how do I want to put them down? I am, again, using opposite papers. The yellow is not going to look great with the yellow tag, but the yellow looks fine with the elephant frame. So, and it's actually the same pattern that I did a similar thing with before. Now, here, I'm trying to decide how am I going to use twine, because now that I've used up the pink twine, I'm like, maybe I can use up the yellow twine, too. It doesn't happen. But I tried. And so I thought, again, I could create a little bit more weight by building it up and using 3 pieces of it all the way across. Here, I actually just decided to tape it to the front of the card because I knew that I was going to cover that area of the front up with the tag anyway, so it made it a little bit easier to line up and make sure it was straight. So I taped it to the front. Then I wrapped it around and taped it to the back. I could have just wrapped it all the way around the card too. That would have been fine. But again, sometimes I just do things randomly. Sometimes there's a good reason. Maybe I should have wrapped it all the way around. I'd used more of the yellow and I could have finished it, but anyway, here we are. And so I'm going to use a bit of foam tape to pop that one up as well. And I'm thinking about how I'm going to finish off this card. There's a lot of yellow going on, and I have only a few pieces of scraps left here. I didn't really like the ice pops that I'd used with the other card, so I kind of went to some other scraps. I liked how this pink piece gave the elephant frame a little bit more weight, but also presented a nice contrast with the yellow. And then I kind of decided to go to town with just layering up little bits of scraps behind this elephant frame. Because as I said, I'm kind of towards the end, don't have much left, and I kind of want to just like use stuff up. I don't want to be left with a bunch of scraps. So I'm actually being pretty bold in the sense of I'm adhering this stuff without coming up with a final design. And I don't always recommend that. I kind of think that it's better to sort of like play with it all together before you adhere anything on, but I kind of just figured I'll make it work. And so I did start taping things on. And I'm going to basically put 3 little pieces of scrap paper in a sort of staggered way behind the elephant so that he has a bit more weight. Because I didn't have any one piece of paper that was large enough that I could, kind of mat the elephant. So 3 papers instead presented a mat. And because I have that pink solid there, it's another opportunity that I could go with a bow, or I could, basically just have some twine there. And since it's faster to just wrap, I kept it quick at this point because I was like, I was towards the end. I was like, I kind of want to be done. And bows, I fuss with bows a lot. I have trouble tying bows, so I decided to just go with the wrap there. So that might be another reason. If you don't like bows, try wrapping twine instead, and you might enjoy it a little bit more. So here is this piece of paper that was like one of the first pieces of papers I cut. I love this piece of paper. It has like this like sunshine look, but it has so many bright colors with it, and I don't want to cover it up. And I knew that, and I knew I wanted to use this side of the paper. Even though it's a little bit tricky to use. So I knew since I didn't really want to cover it up, I should stamp the sentiment directly onto this pattern paper and then add just one little thing. I could have picked a piece of ephemera, but again, at this point I don't have much of it left. However, I did have an elephant cut and I had a lion cut. So I decided that I would use those instead, and I probably should have measured because the lion and the elephant are different sizes. But luckily I squeezed that little lion underneath the sentiment. And because I did stamp them in the same place, which again, probably measuring makes more sense. But, it worked out. So again, I'm thinking like, oh, I want to just leave that black background paper. I don't want to add much to it, but the card felt so plain. So I decided that I would put a little strip of paper across the top. And I did have these pink pieces left. So I didn't think it would detract too much from the card. I wouldn't have wanted to probably put a pattern piece up there. And again, I was trying to make the card feel a little bit more special since I had decided not to do anything else. Like I did the corner rounding, but it was really just a sentiment and image. There's no layers to the card, so I decided, I wanted to do something a little bit more special. So I put that strip across, and then I do the dreaded fussy bow thing, which again, it's really actually not that hard to tie a bow because I just tie them like I tie a shoelace. I like double knot the twine, and then I just literally tie it like I tie a shoelace. I sort of tug at it back and forth, and then I trim the edges. And I personally like to trim the bow ends to about the same length as the bow itself. That's kind of the proportion I like. I know some people like a little bit more substantial tail ends, and I think that looks cute sometimes as well. So with the lion, I'm going to do something similar. I just think I'm going to use orange twine instead. Here I had the little mice that I had stamped on this wood grain paper, and I hadn't used them yet, but I still wanted to since they were already stamped out, and I decided to make them pop a little bit more by putting some color around them. And since I stamped in Copic Safe ink, I could just take a Copic gray marker and just sort of drag it along the outside, and then as I fussy cut the image, the mouse, is going to be brighter than its background, so it's going to pop a little bit more, whereas if I just cut it out of the wood grain paper, it might not have been as cute. And so you could have done this with the elephants as well, and it's just kind of a fun way to, if you don't want to do all the coloring of an animal, you can stamp them, color the outside, and then cut it. And it, it's just an alternative way of making them a little bit more special and making them pop. And I thought having a few mice would help me to make my last couple of cards. I really thought that the mice being that light gray color, I wanted to kind of soften this card. I had a lot of bright colors going on at the beginning, but since I had this wood grain background paper, I had the soft mint stripes and the soft pink stripe piece there, I kind of wanted to like keep in the softer colors. And I don't know how successful I'm going to be because I really like bright colors. Like that teal piece on the background is really like tempting to me because I really like teal. So I probably am going to fail at it, but keeping that soft look. But I was able to cut that 4-inch strip in half and strategically place it behind the 3x3 square so it looks like I have a whole 5-inch strip, but I don't. And so I think that's another fun tip that, if you're going to be covering up a gap anyway, you might be able to get by with a scrap. So I didn't have to try to find a big long scrap. I could use a smaller scrap. And that can be really helpful when working with a 6x6 paper pad and really trying to, use up the whole thing. So I stuck with the cameras. Even though I really like that background paper, I kind of wanted to keep the soft look. So I did it. And then I'm going to add a little bit of twine. I think it might be a twine bow, might be a twine wrap, similar thing behind the mouse. But I said, as I said, I'm going to stop showing you all that because you get it, how the technique works. I had this frame left. And I thought, well, why not just pop the little mouse in a frame? So I had a bunch of the 3x3 squares left, which kind of surprised me because I tend to use those a lot. But I didn't, so I could keep things simple. I put one of the 3x3 squares onto one of the background papers that I had left. The watermelon was one of the, I think at this point, it's the only full sheet that I have left. And so luckily it paired well with this mint stripe here, but I could have always turned it over. And the watermelon slices, the green part of them is actually this mint color, so it pairs really well. I had labels left, so I thought, well, which label does the mouse look best with? Since there was no turquoise in the card yet, I decided to go with the blue label for the mouse instead. I kind of just trimmed it down a bit, and I'm creating 2 really super simple cards there with the little mice. And I'm trying to use up every bit of ephemera, so I had that little yellow sunish looking piece left, and I thought I'm just going to pop it behind the mouse so that I don't have to worry about it anymore, and maybe we'll draw a little extra attention to him. So now all I have left is strips and scraps. But if you have the 2-inch strips left, you can still make card-sized pieces with them. So I decided to do just that. Sometimes I actually decide to do that at the beginning because I know that I really like a pattern and I want to use it as another card base. Like I want to have several cards with that background. But for today's, because I was working with the ephemera and I didn't really know how it would go, I decided to instead save those for the end and see what I had left. So I took 2 of those pieces, laid them right next to each other so they would be 4 inches wide, put a little adhesive down the center of them to stick them to each other. Then I took a different 2-inch strip and covered the adhesive and the essential, like the seam of those 2 pieces of paper. And I had this U rule label left, so I was like, I gotta figure out how to use that. I gotta pull some of the turquoise into it. So I picked up that turquoise scrap, cut it into a banner, but then it was turquoise on turquoise, which obviously didn't look very good, it's fine, but I don't know, I personally didn't like it. So I thought, well, I'll put it on this chunk of wood grain. So I layered that on top. And I still had the alligators. I hadn't used them all this time. And I thought, well, that's perfect excuse then. Now I'm down in the use whatever is left mode. So I was able to kind of arrange it such that the alligator made sense with the layout there. Now I had 2-inch strips left, but none that even matched. So I couldn't make it look like a 4x5-inch paper. But I also had this smile die cut left and a bunch of scraps. So you can see here I'm trying to layer all kinds of scraps together. So I took 2-inch strips that didn't match, and I glued them together and put a different 2-inch strip on top of it. And then I was like, well, there's a camera left and there's a little bit of camera paper, so, you know, make it a little more matchy-matchy. And I layered the sunglasses on the camera, again, trying to use up more of that yellow twine. So I did a little twine wrap there, because again, that camera paper is busy, so a bow wouldn't stand out as much. Twine wrap is better in this instance, and nice and quick. Put a little foam tape and pop that up. And this time I went with a thinner foam tape because I had a little thin area and I have to cut the scotch in half, but you know, cutting the scotch in half is also not a big deal. If you have multiple types of foam tape, great, but really I think scotch will do the best because it also doesn't gum up your scissors when you cut it in half. Other foam tape has gummed up my scissors when I try to cut it in half. I don't like that. So anyway, now that little pile there is literally all I have left of everything. And I have an alligator in there. I don't know if you can quite see him yet, but there's very little left. And I was like, you know what though? I'm still going to make one more card because I had 24 cards and there was 24 pieces of paper, which is always my goal. I always like to get at least as many cards as there are pieces of pattern paper, but I thought I can squeeze out one more. So I took out a piece of white cardstock and I cut it to 4 by 5 1/4. And I thought I'm just going to kind of like layer pattern strips on it because most I had was strips. But I also had that 3 by 3 square. So I thought, well, that'll be my focal point, and then I'll just put strips all around it in an interesting way and mix up the different patterns, and that way I can use up a lot of the scraps. So I decided an angle would make it, again, a little bit more interesting, and then I wouldn't have to worry about laying everything straight, because when you lay one thing straight, you got to lay everything else straight. So sometimes it's easier to intentionally make everything a little funky, and so that's what I did. Then I started layering some strips, and I would, you know, put down a couple strips, then I'd stop and I'd trim from the back, because then I could use the pieces that I trimmed off to also kind of fill out the card. And I am making sure not to put 2 patterns next to each other. And sometimes if I, you know, because I don't have a lot left, flipping it over. So instead of putting those 2 pieces of turquoise next to each other, I flipped it over and used the other side of the paper because it'll still coordinate well, but it will allow me to kind of mix up the patterns. Sometimes using the multi-medium adhesive, multi-matte medium from Ranger was a little bit better than using the strip adhesive because the strip adhesive, like you really have to fill every little piece of it because you can see that the blue gets really thin towards the top and the liquid glue kind of approaches that a little bit better, if you understand. I don't know, hopefully that makes sense. But like sometimes when you're working with really tiny pieces, the Scotch tape gun that I use doesn't really work very well. So I'm going to keep layering on a bunch of strips there, but that's it. There's no more paper left, and I have my 25 cards. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you are interested in more crafting tutorials, including 6x6 paper pad tutorials, be sure to subscribe to my channel. As I mentioned, this is a guest design video for Scrapbooking with me, so be sure to check them out in the video description below. Get your coupon code so you can place your order. And I will have a coordinating blog post with more information about all of these cards, and you can check me out on social media as well in the video description. Thank you so much for watching and putting up with this super long video. I hope that it was helpful and has given you some fun ideas. Have an awesome day. Bye.